Today we're going to have a chat about some of the things to think about when starting a new 40k army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about new armies on the channel. I'm sure it's an experience that the vast majority of the people watching this video have had at some point during the hobby. How exactly you go about collecting and painting a new force of 40k miniatures, whether it's coming into 40k completely new, or by being tempted by a whole bunch of other new shiny miniatures to get a completely different experience of playing the game. In this one I'll just share some ideas on choosing and planning an army, things to think about for first purchases, and a bit on assembly, painting, first games, and expanding an army from there. I do know that collecting a new force is a different thing for basically every single person. There's no real right or wrong way to go about it, and I'd be very interested to hear your take on it down in the comments below. With all that being said, let's jump straight into it. So before you can go about collecting a 40k army, you need to choose which one you're going to be collecting. It's most certainly an entire subject in itself, and it is one that I have made another video on, which I'll link down in the video description. 40k has now around about 26 distinct factions, arguably a few more if you include some minor ones, and there's a lot of things to attract you to every single army. There's the lore and background of the faction, and how they function in the 40k narrative, including the motivations of your individual army and what you think their ends might be on the tabletop. There's the actual miniatures of the army, whether or not you think they look good, and whether you think that you're going to be able to paint them. You might really love the idea of playing Deathwatch, for example, but painting loads and loads of black power armor can be famously a bit of a slog. In general, most seasoned hobbyists will advise you to buy something that you really like the look of the miniatures on the table. Gameplay styles and powers of armies can change over time, but provided you really like the look and feel of your army, then you're going to have something that's going to last you down the years. In general, the actual gameplay feel of the army doesn't tend to change massively, and that can be something that you really want to build an army around. You might want a really tough or resilient force for something like Death Guard or Necrons, something that can just laugh off enemies' damage, or you might want to play a really melee-heavy army and might go for something like Orcs or a Tyrannid Swarm. You can of course get very different gameplay styles out of the same army though. For example, you could build an Orc Speed Freak list with loads of bikes and buggies, or even make Tyrannid gun lines if you want to, with various shooty bugs. I think it's worth being aware of the current strength of the army in the game. Most people tend to enjoy having a fighting chance of winning games, and Games Workshop isn't always super well known for balancing the various different factions. Some tend to be stronger and more forgiving than others. Currently in tournament play at least, armies like Space Marines, Chaos Demons, Harlequins and Sisters of Battle are all doing very well, where some armies such as Craftworld Eldar and Tau are struggling a bit. I'd bear in mind though that game balance really can change at the drop of a hat. If Games Workshop updates all the points values with chapter approved, it's not impossible that the strongest things could become the weakest, and vice versa. It does mean that if you build the absolute strongest list at the moment, it isn't likely to remain the strongest as the edition unfolds. Finally, there's cost of the armies. Many people want to aim for a 2,000 point army of 40k miniatures, and some armies will just be very easy to achieve that with less money investment compared with others. Elite armies tend to do a little bit better out of this. Things like Space Marines and Custodies and Imperial Knights tend to be a bit more forgiving for the amount of money invested for the amount of points you get, where some armies such as Imperial Guard, Sisters of Battle, Admech and Genestealer Cult are all quite expensive as they go. There really can be quite a lot of factors that push you one way or another, but if you are already collecting a 40k army, it can be quite nice to have a different experience of another force. Say if you've been playing a very shooty Space Marine army, you could try something a bit more close combat orientated, maybe a horde of Chaos Demons or Tyrannid Gribblers. It'll give you a bit of a different perspective and more options to play when you are arranging games. There are some benefits for keeping things that you could ally into your original army though. Say if you were collecting Space Marines, it might actually be quite easy to start building up a small force of Sisters or Admech, for example. They have their own interesting units and combos, and you could potentially mix and match between the Space Marines and the other factions if you wanted to in any given game. So once you have come down on choosing a 40k army, you can then think about planning out the project. You can start thinking about a colour scheme and exactly how you're going to implement it with what sort of techniques, and I typically recommend experimenting on a few models to see exactly how it looks in reality before committing to painting an entire army that way. Choosing a colour scheme is really quite an important step, to be honest. The ways that you decide to implement the techniques could make it a lot easier to get the models finished, and I both try and think about how the models will look when held up close and also how they'll look when ranked up en masse, which can be quite different things. I'd strongly consider using things like airbrushes or contrast paint to make the process a bit faster. Then you can go on to think about the lore for your particular army, whether they're representing an actual force from the official narrative of 40k, say the Ultramarines 2nd Company, or whether they're a force of your own creation, say a Chaos Space Marine warband that's dedicated itself to hunting down and destroying the Imperial Church. It's a big galaxy and there's many stories to be told, and I think it can be quite fun to get some headcanon going before you start the project, as it gives you the opportunity to express certain aspects of the lore on the actual modelling and paint schemes of the models themselves. You can think about which units that you most want to field and in what sort of combinations. Maybe you've seen some used on the other side of the table, the sheer amount of attacks that can be thrown out by a massive mob of orc boys, or the high-speed game-breaking tricks that can be employed by the Harlequins. It can be quite fun to draw up a rough goal for a 2,000 point list to start aiming for, though I wouldn't necessarily stick too rigidly to it, as you get more experience with the army, you might realise that certain units fit your playstyle a bit better. Before buying any individual units, you can think about proxying in units with other models, or using things like Tabletop Simulator, where you can potentially try out the entire army in a game or two. Finally, you can think about if you're going to do anything fancy with the models, such as magnetising them to be able to swap out different gear, or for ease of transport. Some units are just really good for this, such as Lehman Russ battle tanks. There's plenty of good tutorials online. So now you might have a plan of roughly where you're headed, you can think about the first purchases to make for the army. I typically start with a few units that are likely to be used in pretty much every game, kind of heart of the army type choices, usually including HQs and troops choices to fill out detachments. For orcs, maybe a war boss and some boys might be a good start. For space marines, maybe some intercessors and a captain of some flavour. I would quite likely be led by any discount bundles available for the faction as well. It can be a very easy way to start getting a fair few units together at a fairly cheap price. Things like this start collecting orcs box are pretty ideal. Maybe when you've fully fleshed out your army, you might not be using every single one of the units in every game, but it's a great start to get a lot of plastic down on the tabletop without spending massive amounts to do so. I'd also feel free to buy anything that you find particularly cool for the faction fairly early. If the awesome look of the Void Dragon Catan shard is one of the things that attracts you to the Necron faction, it might still be a very good choice to pick up fairly early in collecting, even if it might not make massive amounts of sense to include in very small games. If it's fun and you love the model or the way it plays, then I wouldn't be discouraged about picking up some things fairly early. You could start thinking about getting your force ready for a small combat patrol game of 500 points or 25 power level, and think about what units might be useful for getting a small functioning force down on the table. Rules-wise, I'd think about picking up the Factions Codex, while bearing in mind that 9th edition codexes will be coming out, so current edition codexes won't be lasting forever. It really might not be a bad idea to buy the codex for your faction second hand if you don't have a 9th edition one, as it will be guaranteed to be replaced over the next year or two. I wouldn't typically go too mad on things like supplements or expansions right from the start. Some armies can get a whole load of powerful boosts from them, either from their Psychic Awakening supplement, or perhaps from the Space Marine sub-army supplements, such as Ultramarines or Salamanders. I typically say they're not all that essential for small games though, while you're first starting off. If you really do just want the rules contents from the codexes and Psychic Awakening books right away though, it might actually not be the worst idea to think about that Warhammer app. It is quite expensive at £4 per month, but it might genuinely save you money compared with buying, say, a codex and a Psychic Awakening book if the two are likely to become obsolete at some point in the future. You can also think about faction data cards. They're something that quite a lot of players like to have. Having physical cards for the psychic powers and stratagems and things can be useful, though I'd say they can be more useful for certain armies compared with others. I just generally prefer to use the rulebook more, so I don't tend to pick them up myself, I'll be honest. Once you have got a few models together, it's time to start assembly and painting. People do tend to do this in very different styles. If you're newer to the hobby, I recommend collecting in small jumps, which is what I do myself, buying no more than a unit or two at a time, and getting it assembled and somewhat painted, and adding new units to the army as you go along. It can stop you from getting overwhelmed by seeing a massive sea of grey plastic in front of you, and it might help protect against over-investing in things that you've found out that you actually don't use that much further down the line when you're a bit more experienced with the army. I think different hobbyists have very different relationships with painting in my experience. It really depends whether you enjoy the modelling and painting side of the hobby more than the gaming, as the two tend to pull you in different directions. If you want models down to game as quickly as possible, it might make more sense to have a fairly basic paint job, and perhaps make heavy use of things like airbrush and contrast paints to get the models to some battle-ready standard, so you're not just playing with a sea of grey plastic minis. If you are making and painting miniatures of really high quality though, it's likely that they're going to take longer, and it might need a bit more of a slow and measured approach to getting the miniatures on the table, and a fair bit more time and effort invested. If you're an experienced hobbyist starting a new army, I'd think about a level of quality that you can implement across the project, though I do like to challenge myself each time I start a new hobby project. Maybe trying to master a new technique, use of colour, or new bit of freehand that I've not used before, as that way you can mainly use the things that you already know while also adding something new to your repertoire. I would absolutely recommend making use of airbrushes, contrast paints, or spray can options where possible. They really can get quite a lot of the donkey work of painting done very, very quickly, leaving you with a bit more time to focus on the fine details or really polishing the miniatures up. Generally, I find that getting a lot of miniatures on the table is a bit of a balance of motivation. I do enjoy the painting side of the hobby, but if you try and do too much of it, it can feel a bit like work. Most people I see tend to advocate doing a small amount of painting each day as a way to relax, often with some music, videos, or audiobooks playing in the background. I would consider varnishing miniatures after painting them to keep the paint job looking pristine. I quite like the Games Workshop's matte varnish myself, and it does tend to protect the miniatures quite well when I play them in game, as there's nothing worse than having a paint job that you've worked very hard on getting all chipped around the edges, which in particular can happen on the older metal miniatures. It can be an extra step with painting, but it might well save you time in the long run if you were to go back and try and touch up the damaged miniatures. Once you've got a force of models together, you can start thinking about the first games with the miniatures on the table, and there's few things as good for motivating a hobby project along than getting to lead your newly completed miniatures against the enemy. Games Workshop has tried to make this as easy as possible by really making a bit of an effort to support Combat Patrol or even smaller games like Kill Team, but once you reach that kind of level there are all sorts of options. You could think about doing an escalation league amongst friends or a local gaming group. You could turn your force into a crusade army to give you a bit of a progressive sense of narrative in games, or if you have the option of allying your army with another one that you already have, you could start fielding your new force as an allied detachment in some games. A new force might not always be the most competitive thing that you could use alongside your current one, but again it will be a way of getting them some table time. So once you've got a small force together, you can start thinking about expanding your army to the next level and adding new and more exotic units. If you do have a few core units such as troops and HQs, you can then go in pretty much any way that you want. Maybe some tanks with heavy firepower, fast hard-hitting assault troops, other more exotic support characters, or even just doubling down on the rank and file to give you even more bodies to throw at the enemy. As well as building up your force towards bigger and bigger games, it can also give you some nice options and flexibility to switch out units, so you can potentially tailor your force to the mission in question, or try out different playstyles, which generally will make your army stronger, as it means that you can always pick the best out of your units. Again, there's really no right or wrong way to do this. I've seen several people buy entire armies of grey plastic at once and get them either sprayed up together with an airbrush or gradually work on them as they go along, but typically I favour a bit more of a slow and measured approach. A lot of the more competitive army builds in 40k revolve around having 3 of the same unit to really maximise a good unit's potential, and even if I do eventually want 3, I will still often collect them one at a time rather than all at once, as I feel from a collecting point of view there are kind of diminishing returns to having multiple copies of the same unit. Sure, say for example in Space Marines at the moment, it might make a lot of sense to have 3 squads of Eradicators in every game, but I'm sure by the time the next chapter approved comes round and they receive a bit of a nerf, they might be a bit more niche in application. Maybe you only want 1 squad and the other 2 might stay on the shelf for quite a while. If strength in game really is quite important to you, I'd consider checking out tournament winning lists for your faction. You can see them on things like Best Coast Pairings or 40k Stats Center, and generally speaking, if any given unit is used in multiple different tournament winning lists, then it's a good indication that it's one of the stronger units in your faction, and you probably won't be too badly off for including it in your army. Finally, a lot of people do tend to collect armies to a certain level and then say they're complete and they're not going to add any more to them. Personally, I don't tend to go down that same philosophy myself. I think I'll always be open to the idea of adding units to any one of my armies if I think that they've become more interesting, or I perhaps want to try out a different playstyle. I tend to limit myself with my own painting speed a bit, trying not to buy too many things until I actually have the ones I have painted, although admittedly that system doesn't always work amazingly when new shiny things come out. In general, I try and very slowly acquire more and more options for an army over the years, not buying too much at any one point, but hopefully over time makes the collection a bit more resilient and means that they have multiple different options to field when a new edition comes out. It does mean that I've wound up with rather a lot of model soldiers though, after about 15 years in the hobby. So I hope some of you have found that somewhat useful or interesting, with some discussion about collecting a 40k army. As I said before, I don't think there's any real right or wrong way to do it, though I do think that some decisions might make your army a little bit more usable, get things on the table a little bit quicker, or maybe save a bit of money along the way. As I said before, if you've got any other tips for adding to this for newer players, please leave them down in the comments below. I'll certainly enjoy having a read myself. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, We'll certainly be keeping the 40k discussion videos coming into the new year, so subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see more. Finally, if you have been enjoying my videos, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description below. Making all of these videos does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support to keep them coming is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's monthly prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.